The Mystery of the Pirate's Treasure, Chapter 7, A Night to Remember. When Chris awakened the next morning, Mike was standing over him. "You're really not going to go through with it, are you?" Chris raised himself on his elbow and rubbed his eyes. "You bet we're going through it." And then as an afterthought, he said, "And keep your voice down, will you? Mom's not here. She's already gone to her class." "What time is it anyway?" Chris asked, throwing back the covers. "Almost 10. Why?" "'Cause we've got lots to do." Chris was pulling on his jeans as he spoke. "For one thing, we've got to get a flashlight." "Why do we need a flashlight?" "Because that dungeon is underground. It'll be dark when the lights are out. That's why." "Chris, listen. 2 kids aren't going to find any buried treasure. Things like that just don't happen in real life." "Now you listen, Mike. I let you in on the secret, didn't I? Are you going to go along with me, or do I have to go by myself?" "Well, I never said I wasn't going. It's just that I still don't see what you hope to find in that dungeon after all these years." "Like I told you last night," Chris spread his hands in exasperation. "The men who did the excavating didn't know what to look for, but we do." "You mean you're going to get over behind that part they've got chained off?" "That's what I mean, and that's why we've got to wait until everyone else leaves." "I still don't like it, Chris. And Mom, all right, just forget I ever mentioned it, will you? And when we get back home, I can tell the fellas all about it and that you chickened out." As Chris went to the kitchen, he felt Mike close behind him. That last remark, he was sure, had served its purpose. "Do you think they leave the lights on after hours in the dungeon?" Mike asked. "I doubt it, but if they don't, it'll be a simple matter of flipping on the switch if we have a flashlight to help us find it." Chris had turned his pockets inside out and was counting his change on the kitchen table. "It'll cost us 50 cents apiece to get in," said Mike. "Heck, I forgot about that. Now we won't have enough to buy a flashlight." And then in a flash he added, "Say, I've got it. You can pay to go in, and a little later I'll come up and ask her if I can go in to look for my brother." "Well, that'll make us look suspicious right from the start. I'll ask Mom. She'll give it to us." "And what will you tell her we want it for?" "I'll tell her it's to go back to the Provost dungeon." Chris's mouth fell open until Mike added, "But of course I won't tell her we're planning to hide among those figures until the place closes so we can plunder." All of a sudden, the hilariousness of the situation hit Chris. There stood Mike, as solemn as if he were planning a murder. He actually looked pained. With a howl, Chris flung himself into a chair and doubled over with laughter. "If you could only see yourself, Mike. Oh, if you only could." Accustomed to his older brother's taunting, Mike withstood his badgering and then asked, "Why don't you ask Nicole to go with us?" All at once, Chris sobered. "I don't want her to go, that's why. And I don't want her to know anything about this, at least not until we find what we're looking for. Now, I mean that, Mike." Okay. Never had Chris known a day to go by so slowly. During lunch, Mike told their mom they wanted to go back to the dungeon, and she seemed pleased that they'd taken an interest in something historical. For a moment, Chris had a pang of guilt. He hadn't meant to deceive his mom. He was put out with Mike. It was his idea that they get the money that way. Now Chris wished that he had just kept his mouth shut. At any rate, they'd finally rounded up the money to buy a flashlight with enough left for 2 admissions. Chris supposed Mike was probably right about not looking suspicious. About a half an hour before time for the dungeon to close, the 2 brothers were buying tickets. With the flashlight bulging from Chris's pocket, they began another tour. If the guide recognized them as the same 2 she had taken through the day before, she gave no sign. All the while she talked of the bottles and pipes, Chris was peering intently at the partially excavated section called Half Moon Battery. Where, he wondered, had the watch house been in relation to the wall? Again he heard the guide tell about the pieces of old bottles with white salt glaze and flintlock parts, she said. Chris hadn't remembered hearing that before. Soon they were all ushered into the dimly lit chamber where the prisoners had been kept. A creepy feeling came over Chris. It was much eerier than he remembered. The wax figures looked amazingly real. As before, the recording droned on in their ears. The dungeon was a foul place that smelled of sickness and death. It must have been terrible, Chris thought, as he looked at the pirates. For a man who had known the freedom of the seas to be in chains, he edged over toward Mike, who looked ashy pale in the gloominess of the room. "When I give you the signal," he whispered, "you get with those fancy-dressed people over there. I'm going to hide with the pirates." "Why can't we get in the same place?" Mike whispered back, and Chris thought he detected a waviness in his brother's voice. Because we might attract attention that way, Chris spoke out of the corner of his mouth, tuning his voice down to his younger brother. We'll have to wait, though, until these people clear out. Trying to act as normal as they could, the boys walked stealthily around, making sure to stay out of sight of the guide in the adjoining room. At long last, the visitors left, and Chris nodded his head to cue Mike. The next time Chris looked in Mike's direction, he was lying face down on the sparse straw with his head buried in his arms. A shiver went up Chris's spine. Mike looked for all the world like one of the prisoners waiting for his doom. Then, as quickly as he could, Chris ducked beneath the chain separating the display and joined the pirates. His legs felt like toothpicks as he propped himself against the wall with one of the buccaneers and slouched low. And then, with more courage than he gave himself credit, he leaned over and borrowed the black eye patch from the pirate next to him. With trembling hands, he slipped it over his right eye. Surprisingly, he could see through it ever so slightly. Narrowing his left eye to a slit, he immobilized himself for what was to come. The recording had stopped, and the dungeon became strangely quiet. Then Chris heard the ring of the register. The lady was preparing to leave. He wondered if Mike was as still as when he last saw him, and somehow, without even seeing him, Chris knew that he was. Footsteps tapped on the brick floor, and then Chris heard low humming. It was as rhythmic as the metronome he used to practice piano by. A metronome keeps the steady beat and goes tick-tock, tick-tock. Was the guide frightened, thinking herself alone? It was downright spooky. Yes, sir, Mike had more guts than he had given him credit for having. A shadow passed the arched entrance, and Chris tensed every muscle in his body in an effort to hold his position. The guide stepped within his hazy view and stood for what seemed an eternity to Chris. Evidently, she was surveying the prison area. Then she walked to the left and paused again. Chris was sure she could hear the pounding of his heart. By the time she turned back to him, the pressure of the close call was almost too much to bear. What if she saw him? What would he say? Suppose she was looking at Mike right now and he moved. His mind whirled in a crazy pattern until suddenly the room was plunged into almost total darkness. Only a faint ray of light seeped from the other room. Chris listened for all he was worth. The clicking of the guide's heels sounded again, and then utter darkness. Chris had thought it was dark before, but now the night of the dungeon thickened about him. A door clanged shut. At last, they had not been found. Still, Chris waited. He hoped Mike would wait too. They couldn't be too careful. Maybe the lady had forgotten something and would have to come back. Minutes dragged as Chris waited. His muscles ached from holding them still so long. Finally, he stretched his legs and almost screamed out. He had touched a body. Another leg, he thought. Careful to keep his arms as close to him as possible, he reached for the flashlight and pressed the button. He threw the beam along the chain and across the way on the other wax figures that looked more lifelike than before, and over to the section where Mike was hiding. Things looked different in the half-shadows. He waited, trying to get his bearings. Then, stepping carefully around the pirates and toward Mike, he let the flash of light play over the figures in an effort to pick out his brother. The beam wavered as his hand shook. Finally, he found him, lying just as he was when he last saw him. "Mike," he called hoarsely, "you can get up now." Chris watched while Mike slowly turned his face up, only to bury it again in his arms. "Mike," he called again, "get up." Is that you?" "Of course it's me, for Pete's sake. Who'd you think it was?" Chris's voice echoed off the brick walls. "What's that on your eye?" Mike was cautiously getting to his feet. "Oh, that," said Chris, putting his hand to the patch on his eye. "I borrowed that one off of one of the pirates and forgot to return it." Gaining a little more courage, he slipped it off and stuffed it in his pocket. "Gee whiz, it's dark." Mike's voice sounded hollow as he got to his feet. "Yeah, the first thing we got to do is find the light switch. It must be over to the left. That's where the lady was headed when the lights went off." "It's probably under the speaker," offered Mike with a little more voice. Chris shined the beam of light in that direction. The boys followed it. The wall felt cold and damp as they ran their hands along it to find the switch. "Here it is," said Chris, yet when he flipped the switch, no light came on. Instead, a voice began. "In the year 1718, Major Stede Bonnet and his crew of—" He flipped on the recording, not the lights. Stopping the voice, they again searched the damp wall, groping in semi-darkness when the small ray of light did not penetrate. Finally, they found the light switch, and once again the wax figures loomed among the shadows. Cautiously, the boys moved to the other room toward the seawall. The faint light behind them made their own shadows appear as giants on the brick wall. Chris let the beam of light play over the cavernous opening of the half-moon battery. "We need the light on in here," said Mike, as his voice shaky in their shadows. Chris felt Mike's nearness as he worked the flash of light up and down the walls. "Light switches are usually near doorways," he said, and Chris realized for the first time that he and Mike had been talking in whispers. Over and over they searched for the controls to the lights near the room's entrance, but to no avail. "What if they hadn't brought a flashlight?" Chris shivered. "Oh, well," said Chris, "we don't have to have the light on in here. You can take the flashlight, shine it over this way for me." Before Mike knew what was going on, Chris was over the chain that marked a boundary for visitors and down in the excavated area of the old seawall. "Oh, no," groaned Chris. "We didn't bring anything to dig with." "Well, they wouldn't have let us in with a shovel." "I guess they wouldn't, but—" Chris slumped over and thought. "I still can't see what you hope to find here." Mike tried to direct the light where he thought Chris wanted it, but the excavated area seemed to soak up the small circle of light. "Just let me think. Just keep quiet a minute and let me think," said Chris. The silence of a tomb fell over them as Mike stood above his brother, pointing the faint beam of light in a path before him. Chris was lost in thought. There has to be something in here. There has to. Why else would the strange men have come in here? Chris had by now fully convinced himself that the letter had been written while Stede Bonnet was imprisoned in the watch house. And maybe, just maybe, the instructions had never reached his sweetheart. Maybe they'd been left here or hidden in the prison somewhere. He tried to explain all that to Mike. Admittedly, the chance of finding something here was slight, but he had to grasp at every straw. And the stranger had come to the dungeon. Why? All of a sudden, Chris reached into a wheelbarrow of artifacts he had noticed earlier in the evening. Grabbing up a sharp, large object he began to pick away at the murky area of the old half-moon wall. Mike stood watching his brother, and then he spoke. "Chris, why do you think they stopped digging under here?" "Heck, I don't know, but they weren't looking for any treasures, I'll bet." "Well, I imagine they thought the building above it would cave in if they dug too much underneath." "Huh?" For the first time since he began his frantic digging, Chris slowed up. "The guide said the exchange building was built over the old watch house," said Mike. "Hey, hold the light over this way. Look at this." Chris held up something in a muddy hand. "Looks like part of the earthen vessel, just like all those others to me," said Mike. Unwilling to let his brother squelch his enthusiasm, Chris continued to dig. His breath came fast and jerky. On Chris dug, ignoring Mike's pleas. He hacked away at the damp earth. He had gone too far to turn back now. Let the rest of them sit around with buried treasures under their feet. He wasn't going to. Frantically, he picked the clammy earth, splattering it against his face and clothing. Chris was unaware that Mike had propped the flashlight so the beam would spread where Chris wanted it and had left his side, until his voice called out to him from the other side of the room. "Chris!" he screamed. "We're locked in. This door won't open without a key."